This is the IEEE Computer Society Distinguished Lecturer Webinar Series brought to you by the Distinguished Visitors Program. The Distinguished Visitors Program delivers tools for individuals at all stages of their professional careers through visits to chapters, offering opportunities for individual interactions, and to the membership through webinars by respected professionals. We have distinguished visitors around the world who cover machine learning, cybersecurity, robotics, big data, cloud computing, blockchain, and cryptography, among others. Chapters can request a distinguished visitor on computer.org/distinguished-visitors. The Distinguished Visitors Program is able to pay up to $1,000 for a visit to a chapter, but by working with other nearby chapters to develop a tour, that amount can be increased. So when your chapter is planning its next event, think of the Distinguished Visitors Program. Welcome, everyone, to our Distinguished Lecturer Webinar Series. My name is Carrie Cosby, and I'm the Chapters Manager at the Computer Society. I oversee our more than 600 professional and student chapters around the world and manage our Distinguished Visitors Program. I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping tasks before we get started. You can ask your questions in the Q&A panel. Dr. Greer will answer these questions as many as he can at the end of the presentation. When you're writing your questions, please, if it relates to a particular slide, make sure you reference that slide. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available after the webinar. The IEEE Computer Society gives professionals within the various fields of computing a space to share their stories and connect with like-minded individuals and enthusiasts. Year after year, various community members from across the globe are added to our ever-growing network. As a part of this global community, you can have the opportunity to share your story, opinion, and insight in our Tech News blog, which is home to articles that cover career advice, current computing trends, and updates within the industry. Additionally, the Computer Society Digital Library features nearly 850,000 papers and articles highlighting the latest research. Furthermore, you can connect and grow with other professionals through various networks and events such as technical communities, conferences, and student chapters. Information will be shared after the webinar. You can also learn more at computer.org. In today's webinar, Dr. David Allen Greer will present Telling Our Stories, How the IEEE Computer Society Develops Professionals. The IEEE Computer Society not only makes us professionals, it turns us into storytellers. We tell our stories about our education, our research, our business, even the times we simply play with the computer technology. We often think that the most important aspect of these stories are the technical information that they contain, while we gain useful knowledge by reading the transactions and proceedings and magazines of the IEEE CS. We also gain deep insights about what it means to be a computer professional and what our community has contributed to the world. The webinar, which is based on the speaker's popular column in Computer Magazine, Body of Knowledge, looks at the kinds of stories we tell ourselves as members of the IEEE Computer Society. I'd like to introduce our speaker. David Allen Greer has spent much of the past decade helping the IEEE Computer Society develop new electronic products, editing its periodicals, and writing for its members. He has served as editor-in-chief of the IEEE Annals of History of Computing, as chair of the Magazine Operations Committee, and as an editorial board member of Computer. Outside the Society, he works as an associate professor of science and technology policy at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., with a particular interest in policy regarding digital technology and professional societies. There, Dr. Greer has worked as a university administrator for the past 20 years and has demonstrated a capacity for organizational management. He served as a leader of the undergraduate computer systems degree, director of the university honors program, assistant dean of engineering, and associate dean of international affairs. This webinar is being brought to you in partnership with the Distinguished Visitors Program and the IEEE Computer Society History Committee. Dr. Greer, I'd like to pass the floor to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Carrie. It's lovely to be here today. I was very pleased to be asked And before I leap into my talk, I'd like to give just a little further push for the Distinguished Visitors Program. I've been participating in it now for a couple of years, 2 years, I think. And I have enjoyed the invitations I've had and the ability to interact with others. I had some early experience with that when I was an officer of the Society now almost a decade ago. And I found that the opportunity to work with chapters and their meetings, just a fascinating time to learn what was of concern to you, what issues needed to be addressed by the Society at large, and how there could be a bigger discussion that would benefit us all. So if you're in a chapter or a section out there and you're looking to do an event, it's actually now quite cheap because you can do it online. I have spoken this year a couple of times in East Africa, once in South Africa, several times in India, and a couple of times in North America, all of which were done via the web, and all of which allowed me an opportunity to understand better what the societies and chapters were doing. So please, I encourage you to think about that. Today, I was asked to talk about stories and the stories that we tell ourselves as professionals. We are great storytellers. We tell all sorts of things about technology, about our peers, about our accomplishments. And I think it is something that we need to do better, that we need to think a little more deeply about what we are telling ourselves and others, and use those stories to promote computing, to develop our own careers, and to help us think better about our place in the world and what we are doing. I think in many ways it's part of our professional duty and our professional requirement to be better storytellers. Let's start with how I got involved in this question. The introduction was a lovely introduction, and I believe all of that was completely true, just not all at the same time at the same place. I really became interested in the stories of computing when I, in fact, had a story of my own to tell. I was, as the introduction said, part of a group called the Computer Systems and Information Sciences Department at the George Washington University. And I had been there a half dozen years or so and had settled in and was moving up the ranks when the university decided to terminate my department. And I went in one day and had my job and was preparing for a new semester. And I went in the next, and all of that was gone, and I had to find a new path. Now, in telling that story, I have buffed it up to a high sheen. I have said that at some point computer science will be obsolete as a discipline. This will be in the distant future, of course. And in that distant future, universities will be terminating computer science departments. And my school just happened to be at the front end. It just did it first. In doing that, I've run over a lot of very important aspects of what actually happened, some of which I knew at the time, some of which I still don't know. The decision to terminate a department is not taken lightly. Universities have a very collegial decision-making process. And what led to the desire to terminate that department and end that work and end those courses required a great deal of thought, a great deal of consultation. And the conclusion was clearly reached that the assets were better used elsewhere. Now, I need to say in my university's defense, about 6 years later, they rebuilt what I would describe as a more conventional computer science department for the time, based in engineering. At that point, my career had moved on. But in watching the process, particularly as I moved into the administrative side of the university life, I began to realize that by telling the story a certain way, I was not doing the university any benefit. I certainly was not doing my peers any benefit, some of whom ended up in more difficult straits than I did, and a couple had to retire much earlier than they intended. And I certainly didn't do the field any good. We make decisions and we develop technologies according to certain forms and structures. And it's important to understand those because in many ways, that's what we bring to the world. the way in which we approach problems, the tools in which we develop solutions, and the way in which we integrate those solutions into our lives. There's one story that's quite similar to the one I tell about my department that you all have undoubtedly heard and is of such great currency that you must have heard it in the last year. I have attended a lot of conferences over the years, particularly during the time I was an IEEE Computer Society officer, and also during the last several years when I've been doing distinguished speaker work. And I'll go to a conference and I'll sit back and someone will get up and say, let me tell you a story. We work in a very important field, but did you know that in 1950, IBM thought there would only be a market for 10 or 12 computers? And then the audience will respond with the usual set of shock and awe, and the speaker will go on to make some other point. This story is really a story about the storyteller. And if you don't know that stories are always about the storyteller, that's one of the little secrets I'll keep to myself, at least for a bit. The story is telling the idea that the speaker is wiser than IBM was 50 years ago, that the speaker sees more clearly what is happening to the world and the importance of technology than a large institution did at mid-century America. That we, and the speaker always inviting the audience to participate, know more and know how to do things better than they did when IBM was starting its upward tick as a technology company. Trouble is that if you think about that story for any length of time, it dawns on you that it's mistold. It's told about the speaker, it's told about us. It cannot possibly be told about IBM in 1950 or 1952. Now, I'm often accused of being a historian, and I think I'm grateful when I am told that. I don't really think I am. History is a very specific discipline, and it involves trying to understand large patterns in human development. I'm much more interested in the human scale of interactions and what individuals accomplish, and that doesn't always fit into the neat modern historical framework. But if we look at the process of the history of IBM and what it was doing at that point, we start to understand a little bit about how organizations make their decisions, and we realize that this story, when told in a better sense, really reflects a quite different lesson. Now, we date the computer age to 1946 in general. We often pin it on the ENIAC, which was nothing like any of the machines we ever use now. It was electronic. It did do calculations. It was programmable eventually. And it's a reasonable time. There are computing machines that predate it, including Charles Babbage's machine, which he very carefully designed and never built, and a few others from the 40s and even late 30s. But there really were not large numbers of computers, and large numbers, I mean more than a dozen, until about 1952. The ones before it were one-offs, they were experimental. The biggest class of them were the John von Neumann machines, the machines that have since formed the basis for this industry, this field, everything we do. IBM was interested in taking the von Neumann design, as many others were, turning it into a product. They did a study, and the product that they eventually came up with was a machine that eventually received the name IBM 701, the defense calculator. It was a programmable machine. Its architecture would be familiar to anyone on this webinar. It's an architecture that's very similar to the basic core of the chips that run our phones and our laptops. And they were interested in who would buy this machine with no experience in running them, with no software to mention other than some very crude pieces, and would need a large staff and a large set of problems to solve. They did a market study, and they came up with a list and began to market the computer. The marketing, since it was a machine that cost multiple millions of dollars in that age, and it technically was not sold, it was leased, it required a certain kind of customer and required the president to get involved. But to get to that point, and this is the key thing in understanding it, IBM had to think long and hard about how it was allocating its resources. It was run by a capital committee of about a dozen vice presidents, a little less. And they would debate about whether they would get enough return on their investment, how they would have to reallocate personnel, build new factories, get new technologies, get new skills. They had a little bit of an electronic skill, enough to get started on it, and they were marketing electronic products. But they would need to rebuild the company. In the end, by the time 4 years has passed, they have found 18 buyers, or 18 customers who would lease it. They were, for the most part, the defense contractors of the age. If told in that light, it becomes a story of corporate transformation and corporate decision-making. And in that, we say they budgeted for 12, if that's indeed the number, and they sold 18. That's a relatively successful piece of business work. It's building a product that met a market and moved into a market that was bigger than they anticipated by an interesting amount. So, it's an increase of 50%, and an increase of 50% over an original market estimate, I would say, is a major success. So in that process, the story turns itself over, and it becomes a story of successful planning, of successful engineering, of successful marketing, and ultimately of successful utilization, because these were the first mass-marketed version of von Neumann's architecture. Okay, we have undone that story. So what? Why? We've changed the myth, got a little better sense on it. We change that. We want to look at it because the stories we tell about ourselves, we want to do it in a good way. We want to do it in a way that helps us understand our place in the world. We really want to do this because our world is constantly changing, and we're the ones doing the changing. We are driving innovation and disruption and other activities in a way that few other fields do. And to stay part of this field, to stay active, you need to know your place, you need to know what you're doing, you need to know your relations to the others around you, and you need to understand what is happening. So when we tell stories, that's what we're actually doing. We're recentering ourselves. And right now we do it badly. We generally demand that others meet us on our turf. We want to describe our technology the way we see it, and in particular the way our individual members see it. Their work in the research lab, their work in product design and development, their work in product management, their work in product support, any of those things. And in fact, stories are best told when we flip it over and say, we'll meet you on your turf. We'll explain to you what we do and do it in a way that affects the broad patterns of human behavior, of business behavior, of educational behavior, of political behavior, and do it in a way that gives you insight not only into us, but into the greater human condition. Our basic story that we do time and again, and as editor both of the Annals and the editor of Computer Magazine, which I just finished a couple years ago, the stories that I kept getting from writers, from columnists, were, we're misunderstood. You need to change your thought about us. And I kept trying to work with these as an editor and say, can we flip it over and say, we have something big that we can tell you. We have something that will be of value to your life, to your activities, to you no matter what you are and what you do. There are a number of story forms that we can use, and I'm going to focus on 4, which have been the hallmark of my column. The column is currently called The Body of Knowledge. It has had 4 or 5 names since I started writing it in the early aughts. It's always been the same column at base. Understanding the human contributions of the members of the Computer Society and explaining that first to ourselves and then to the bigger world. There are 3 kinds of stories that I would like to do that I think computer scientists have specific, special insight that benefit the world and explain what it is that we do. These are the coming of age story, the continuous improvement story, and the disruption story. And if we understand how those stories work and how to tell them, we will be better storytellers, and we will be doing ourselves, our profession, and our field a great benefit. Let us start with the coming-of-age story. If you've ever been in a technology museum, be it the Smithsonian, which is near my house in Washington, this slide is of the Computer History Museum, a lovely museum out in Mountain View. There's a lovely computer museum, oddly, in Bozeman, Montana, with a very nice collection. The Deutsches Museum in Munich is also quite good. And the Science Museum in London has the rebuild of one of Babbage's machines. All of these are fascinating, and they provide exhibits that are of great interest to our members, and you should attend them and patronize them. There's a tableau that you see in these museums all the time. It's a family. It's, without being too stereotypical, it's an older man with a younger woman next to him, his daughter, undoubtedly, and two little kids who are probably the daughter's kids. And the father, the grandfather really, is standing in front of some exhibit and pointing at it and telling a story. The daughter is quite anxious. It's her father, of course. She wants her kids to understand and appreciate him. She knows he did something important. She herself is not completely clear of that, but she wants her kids to experience him, to know him while he's there and with them and can talk and be part of their lives. And the kids, of course, are getting antsy. They are sitting there and saying to themselves, what's going on? I have no idea. Because at the key base of this, they were dragged on this and they were promised ice cream. And they are very aware that ice cream has not appeared, and it's not at all clear to them when it's coming. This is a stock photo image to illustrate it, but I thought the two kids exactly captured it. The little girl looking ahead going, I've heard this before. My ice cream? We had a deal, didn't we? And the boy is going, one more. I just have to hold on for one more minute. I know it's going to get here, but I've got to have this thing. It's a little bit of a sad time, but at the same time, it poses a certain kind of lesson that's important for us to understand. The story is very rarely a technical story, although it's often couched in this. There's this device, this software, this piece that I worked on that was important. But the real story that's being told is a coming-of-age story. A coming-of-age story is when someone demonstrates skill enough to take a responsible role in the community. I have mastered this, and it became the basis of my research. I mastered this, and it became my company. I mastered this, and it improved computer science and improved lives. And when you're telling it to a family group, you're saying, this has made my career possible. This made you as my family possible. This made you as kids possible. Now, as it's important for this because it's a very common piece, but with computer science and with computing and with a technical professional society, we tend to do these things a little more formally and a little more rigorously. We have specific ways that we demonstrate technical skill. We have ways that we demonstrate technical judgment when you make a good enough decision about how things go forward. And we accredit that and we reward that. And when we need to think about putting our stories into that format and thinking of them as such, that gives us an ability to not only put ourselves in a good light, but to help the bigger society and the bigger world understand how they work and how they interact with us. Let's take this picture as a coming-of-age photo. It's on the web. You can find it in a second by Googling Maniac, M-A-N-I-A-C, computer, and you'll get a half dozen versions of this, some that have nothing to do with it. And this one, Maniac computer. It's the first electronic computer that was built at Los Alamos Laboratories in New Mexico, part of the atomic bomb project. It comes after World War II, after the first use of the bomb. It is, and as with all things in the history of technology, a bit disputed. The people who built it and their intellectual heirs claim that it was an important first operating computer and that it predated von Neumann's work. You read the documents and you see how it works. It's clearly highly derivative. It has some interesting elements that it adds to von Neumann's work. And in particular, it's important in that von Neumann didn't care about some of the niceties of devices, particularly input and output. And they started worrying about it. It's a lovely photo. It's undoubtedly staged. If you look at the lights on the woman's eyes, they had floodlights. They put it up. It allowed them to outline her against a backdrop. It was a tubed computer, so it was run in a highly air-conditioned room. So the likelihood of that dress being her day-to-day work dress, if she worked in that room, is zero. The switches on the side that she is touching with are not things that common operationals would deal with. And besides that, she's a programmer. That woman is Lois Lurgans. She was an early programmer of the machine. She worked at Los Alamos right at the end of the war and then moved on and was there for a certain period longer. It was for her, and you see it in her face, it was an important part of her life. She was in her early 20s and her career. She mastered a certain amount of programming, and programming at that point meant not assembler, it meant programming in octal. Laying out the instructions, figuring out how to manage memory with no guidance whatsoever. How to work with mathematical approximations and implement them, and deal with, in particular, the Los Alamos machine, three-dimensional integration and Monte Carlo problems. They were a crucial part that they contributed a great deal, and she did a great deal to make work. She was very proud of that time, and again, I think you can see this in her face and with the kind of strength in the arm that she's holding up, that this was where she became an adult, and she was very proud of it and very proud of her contributions. It, of course, made her life and family possible. Perhaps not the same way a man's would at that time, but nonetheless possible. Her daughter was Susan Lurgans, who goes off and becomes one of the first generations of data scientists. That daughter was on my PhD committee. She was one of the persons who reviewed my work. Part of that story refocuses on an explanation of how ideas go from one generation to a next. It identifies someone as starting the chain, as getting the first sense of mastery and passing it first to her daughter and then to me. That kind of story is common, maybe not in that form, maybe not with those details. But when we think about how we develop, thinking about how we gain mastery and how we pass that mastery forward is an important part of our storytelling. I perhaps caught that most clearly of my coming of age. I can point to about 5 different things. In 2009, my career had gone in several different directions, and I was working on science policy then and a variety of things. I was an officer of the IEEE. I'd edited journals in several different forms. And one of the things that happened the fall of that year is I got a phone call from a company in California that said, we'd like you to keynote a conference. I love keynoting conferences. It's a great thing. It allows me to talk, and I love talking, and tell stories. And I said, great, and the time was October, which is great in San Francisco, and it was going to be a lovely time, and I started figuring out all the things I was going to do while I was out there. And then I said, oh, by the way, what's this conference about? And they said, oh, crowdsourcing. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't know anything about it. And then the guy at the other end said, but my boss said you were the expert. And I said, talk to me. Tell me what this is. And we talked, and I learned about the growing gig economy that was starting to grow in San Francisco. Uber, the companies that become Upwork, Topcoder, Amazon's Mechanical Turk. And as he described the process, I learned very quickly that I do a great deal about it. I had done a lot of research on it. I'm very interested in labor and computation and how we develop it, how we use it, how we expand it, how we bring along the next generation of technical leaders. And that in particular, I had traced the origins of gig work and market-based management back to the 30s, and I could show how it developed in modern corporations using modern technology. So I went. I prepared a keynote. Went down there. The keynote was in the afternoon. And I went through talking with the various people. And again, there are companies now that are very familiar. Amazon was there. Uber was there. Lyft was there. Upwork was there. TaskRabbit was there. And in talking with them, I got a very clear sense of the story they needed. They needed a story that said, we are seeing a technological transformation. We are building a new industry with that technology. Tell us it's important. Tell us that it's going to be a permanent contribution. Tell us that we are fundamentally changing the world. Didn't take much to adjust the talk, but that's the talk I gave. The talk was, you are moving into an adult world, if you will. Your world moving into the mature economy. Your task and what we are seeing you do is demonstrating that you are of age, that you are responsible, that you have a technological knowledge base that you are adding. And I finished the thing on time. I had a lovely slide to end it, and I have rarely felt an audience response like I did there. And that led me into 4 or 5 years of work with this group. I headed up their trade association for a while, worked on several aspects of rights for gig workers and other things. But what that told me was the importance of framing stories that way, and how helping people understand their place meant helping them understand how they are coming of age. Much of my storytelling, including coming of age and including the next one, the idea of continuous improvement, has its origins in my father's life and career. My father was an early member of the computer industry. He worked both for Univac and Burroughs Computers, and this is a picture of Dad with what I call his family, because surrounding him is his family of computers, IBM, mid-60s, mid-sized computers. There was a period when I was a teenager, a few years after this. I'm about 10 in this picture, and I'm actually off camera a little bit to the right, that I had an internship at Dad's company. And I got to drive. I was mostly a night operator and, setting up computers. And then I would get a job going on, and I'd go down to a terminal, and I'd spend hours programming, figuring out what to do. It was great fun. It was very educational. Often I would get to ride in with Dad and one of his coworkers, John J. Bo Hannon. Bo and Dad worked in basically product management. Dad was essentially dealing with technical customers and how to get their staffs educated and prepared. Bo had other aspects of product management. Bo was an interesting character, what he called a long-standing bachelor, which I had no idea at the time meant gay. He said once that he didn't want to get married because what woman would take him, a man who used bed sheets for curtains, and why would he, a perfectly respectable man, take a woman who would accept a man who used bed sheets for curtains? And so there was no way out of it. He had a realm of what he called dirty jokes, which were really, really bad puns that were not really all that dirty. They were actually more embarrassing. He told one about how he had just purchased a van to go on a trip out west, and he was trying to put a radio in it, and he was having trouble, and took it to the repair, and they said, well, we're having trouble with the antenna. And Bo said, what do you mean? The antenna's wrong? He said, yes, it's falling apart. In fact, it's the worst case of van aerial disease I've ever seen. And it's a terrible pun. You can easily say it in mixed company. And he thought this was the funniest thing, and he would laugh at what happened. Dad and Bo were both masters of the idea of continuous improvement. They would talk about it, and much of their discussions was about how to take what they were doing and do repeatedly and improve this section or improve that section. It's something that is the foundation of computer science, of software engineering, of engineering writ large, and has been for now almost 90 years. One of the stories that came out of Dad rather than Bo was the story of a young woman who worked for the company named Rosemary. Ro was a young woman about a decade older than me who had learned about Fortran in college and was starting to study it when she was involved in an accident, I believe fell down some stairs and broke a hip and had to drop out of college and then had trouble getting back in because she'd lost a scholarship. And she was step by step able to find jobs as programmers and working computers and had worked her way up in boroughs, doing a variety of technical things. She was one of the first students, one of the first women to get qualified on the borough's large systems operating system, which drove its basic concepts from an MIT operating system. That operating system, under that operating system, the words for starting a new programming, the word for it, was forking, F-O-R-K-I-N-G, which sounds like a sexual term. And the guys that wrote, and they were all guys, the borough's operating system made great fun of that and wrote an underlying operating system in which the actions were more than a little pornographic, or at least, highly sexualized. And there was one key section that was clearly set up to define starting a program as a rape. Rosemary is taking the course on how this operating system is built and how she can modify it. And there's another woman in the course, and the instructor has never taught this course to a woman before. And even though there are 20 people in the class, he finds himself tongue-tied, unable to speak, stumbling through, shrugs his shoulders, yes, no, you know, this, whatever. And Rosemary, being a very direct person, marches up in to Dad's office, who was at that point in charge of technical education, and says, this is unacceptable, you have to fix it. Dad listens to Ro and realizes very quickly this is a business problem. This limits the market for the computers. If you cannot teach the operating system to women, to sensitive men, to anyone, you're in trouble. And he grasps it and he moves in, he calls in and gets a meeting for Rosemary with the head of engineering, sits in it, but lets Rosemary walk around and bring this problem to the fore. And this is the key bit of continuous improvement. Continuous improvement involves identifying problems, assessing what you're doing, and isolating one problem that's a decisive problem, and then solving it. And Dad brought Rosemary in and let her do that. She viewed it as her problem, her complaint, and he guided and let her do it. At first, the head of engineering was adamant, we've spent far too much money on this thing to change it. It's just superficial. Just, grow up, be strong, and face it. And step by step, he began to grasp that it was a limit on business, and it was a limit on business that could be laid at his door. The first thing that happened was that the instructor was changed in the course. The second thing was that there was a plan put in place to depornography, as it was called, the operating system. And it took a very silly, stupid narrative, but nonetheless, it was one you could teach to anybody. And Rose went back to class. They did the whole operating system, and at the end it was a 2-week class. The new instructor, who was really a gruff, no-nonsense guy, decided to show off how tough he was and said, at the end of the class, I usually take the class out to celebrate. I usually take them to the Playboy Club. And he turned and stared at Ro. Said, bet you've never been to a Playboy Club. Rosemary stared back at him and said, I used to work at one. There was a moment pause as the rest of the room gasped. And she said, the costumes are uncomfortable. They don't let you take tips. You can't even give customers your name. If I can't make that work, if I could make that work, why would I be here? And if I can't make this work, I'll just move on again. And it resonated throughout the whole class. The guy then rolled back his head and laughed and did more than a little change. But it was this shudder that something had shifted. Well, when I heard this story from Dad and Bo turned this into one of his embarrassing puns. I don't remember, but he thought it was so much fun. 8 months later, I have quit. I finally finished school, graduated, I've applied for a job. It's in a different city at a different borough's facility. I am starting as an entry-level programmer, and my boss is Rosemary. I didn't interview with her. I don't remember why at this point. But I was there and had my desk, and about a week later, she shows up. She walks over to my desk puts her fingers on the desktop, stares me in the face and said, "You're Tom Greer's boy." I said, "Yes." She said, "Do you know?" I said, "I think I do." She said, "It's my story. Do we understand that?" And I sort of gulped and said, "Yes." And the interesting point was knowing that story and sharing that story was a bond. And in particular, she did for me what Dad had done for her. I found myself as a programmer. It was a scientific processor and downstream version of the ELIAC 4 that we were working on. I was very quickly one of the experts on programming it. And someone came to me and said, "We've got a sale if you can demonstrate that it meets these performance marks." And I said, "It won't meet these performance marks." And he said, "Well, forge them." And I was self-righteous, and I said, "This is terrible, and this is got to be stopped, and we need to fire this guy." And Rosemary sat me down and said, "That's not going to fix anything. This is what we do." And she step by step worked it so that I brought this issue to the right forum. We got it in the right place. We took other issues off the table about the needs to get this machine sold, about the needs to demonstrate how it worked, until this was the one issue that was blocking improvement. And at that point, the senior boss said, "Fix it." And we were done. And it was that same process of going from one generation to another and from isolating problems and using them to improve what we were doing that Ro talked to me. And when we focus on that as the process, as the key part of continuous improvement, we start seeing it everywhere, and we start seeing the way that it works in the bigger society, and that we can contribute to it because we do it in a much more formal manner. So let's move on to the third storyline, disruption. Clay Christensen, disruptive products, disruptive industries, disruptive technologies. It's been a mode of our operation since the late 80s. Clay Christensen only recently passed away. And his ideas, I think, are going to resonate through for another 10 or 15 years as we think about where we are. It was something that I first hit when I was sort of in between technical jobs. When I was an early dean, I was responsible for residential programs at my university. And as part of it, I was very adamant about getting internet connections. And even then it wasn't internet, it was pre-real internet. Network connections for my dorms. I was a great fan of these kids. And one of them, they set up a Napster site. Hadn't heard of them. For those of you on the phone, on this webinar who've not heard of them, they provided technology to distribute music for free. What's interesting about this process was that after I saw it and got experience with what my kids were doing with it, I had a reception of some sort where I found myself standing next to an attorney from the Record Industry Association of America, who, aided by a little bit of too much to drink, was railing about this new stuff and these new kids, and they were going to be taught a lesson, and this was going to be killed. And I realized as he was talking, two things were happening. One I understood, one I didn't completely understand. The first one was that this technology was going to greatly reduce the distribution and marketing of music, that its ability to move through the community was greatly speeded up and the costs lowered. The other was I didn't quite see how the institutions of the record industry were going to adjust. And those institutions included record companies, radio stations, record stores. There used to be a thing called them. But as we all saw it play out, those institutions had to adjust, and they had to change in a very radical way. I kept a little bit of touch with that lawyer for a while, maybe a year or two. And for a time, he was touting his great victories in preserving the record industry. And of course, we know what happened. I saw a similar thing and was more directly involved in running those networks because I was basically a university administrator who was running a network node who really had no business doing so. I got on a listserv discussion group of people like myself who were talking about the technology of keeping these things going. And sometime in the middle of this, a group of Chinese students who also ran mid-sized network nodes took it over and started discussing politics in China. Yeah, it was kind of interesting. That interested me, so I started following it. Eventually, we kicked them off because they were off topic, but they set up their own listserv, and I started following it. And with that listserv, I very carefully and thoroughly followed the events that led to the Tiananmen Square uprising of '89. I kept all the discussion groups. They were fascinating, including the June 6th one, which was really quite heartbreaking. And I thought to myself, there's an article here. What is the article going to say? And the first thought was, as I sat down to write it, which is now about 5-6 years later, there was the internet at Tiananmen Square, and wasn't it cool? That really didn't capture what was going on. And it required me to go back and refine my view of this, to analyze it, to look at it. And step by step, I discovered that it first was subject to a continuous improvement process. These are examples of 3 postings on this listserv over that spring. And you'll see they are becoming ever more sophisticated. The first one is just a posting. The second one has a table of contents. The third has Chinese characters done, and I know this is now an old ancient art form, done out in typewriter characters. There was a sense of improvement. But the bigger issue that happened was that the institutions of the time were not able to thoroughly exploit this technology. And a new set of institutions had to grow up that could. In particular, for terms of Chinese students, they set up an independent Chinese Student Association that utilized this, that became the backbone of their discussions, that began to move ideas out and communicate with themselves. Prior to that, they did a variety of things to keep in touch with other students in North America and the United States. With this, they could all be together. So I started writing that up, and as I did, I also became aware of one more thing. There were professionals involved. Not only were they doing this of refining and making their system better and better, there were voices that were starting to appear that explained what was going on, that helped them build new institutions. The most prominent of these voices I traced to a law firm on K Street in Washington, D.C., to someone who was indeed their advisor, who was helping them restructure their work. And that told me something about the process of disruption. We do continuous improvement. It has much in common with it. The difference is, of course, that current institutions don't have the ability to make use of these new facilities. And someone, and it usually has to be a professional, steps in and guides the group into the creation of new institutions and structures. For me, the fascinating thing about this was it gave me great insight into how Chinese students work in Chinese technology. And within a few years, I found myself as a leader of the Computer Society, dealing with our Chinese counterpart, the Chinese Computing Federation. And I found myself writing for their periodical. Still do on occasion. This is a poster from last year when I, weeks before the pandemic, went to talk with them and interact with them and see their current state and what they were doing. But it's a technical process that led to a social process that is repeatable in other forms. And that's the basic lesson that I'm trying to leave with you as we go ahead. That what we do is universal. It involves technology, and there are stories we can tell about that technology, but it's universal, and if we can see that universality and communicate it, we can not only help others understand us, we can understand our roles better. There's, of course, one great master storyteller in our history, and that's Steve Jobs. And Jobs will be remembered for so many things, but one of which was how he used the coming of age, the continuous improvement, and the disruption stories to his benefit. The stories that he told, generally the details were things like, we are going to make you more creative, we're going to let you do more, we're going to let you live more fulfilled lives. And you did this by moving into a bigger society, by improving what you did, by substituting new institutions for old. He was a master at it. And one of the ways that you could see his mastery is how he changed his corporation at least twice, arguably 3 times. Now, he himself took more than a few knocks in that step to do it. His first attempts were not as successful as he would like to tell. But as you look at the story, you can see step by step ideas about taking responsibility, about improving things and making single issues decisive, about transforming institutions. So that's where we get back to where we end. And where we end is, of course, always where we started. One of the aspects about industrialization as a whole, and indeed about computing as a whole, is the institutions are short-lived. We see around us the remnants of organizations, of institutions, of departments, of classes, of technologies that were once central to our lives that have gone. We tend to mock them when they go, that they're still using a BlackBerry, that someone still likes vinyl, that that person is in love with his old mainframe computer. And I know more than a few people who run mainframe computer clubs and keep an old CDC something or another in their basement. But in fact, all of these are examples of storytelling that we can help ourselves move forward. And when we see the remnants, we ask, where's the coming of age? Where's the continuous adjustment? Where is the disruption? Because ultimately what we're talking about is changes of the world around us and how we move in to fit into that. That is an important side of what we do. And it's an important side of where we are. And when we look back, for example, my father's computer company, Burroughs, in theory still exists. His company died as he was retiring and his generation was retiring. 4 years after he was gone, the company was unrecognizable. And the building that he worked in, which was a major employer in downtown Detroit, is now a healthcare center. It's a remnant of his life and his time. And the story behind it was once that was an industry making use of the technical community in southeastern Michigan. Once that was able to build a very strong industry using that talent to contribute to computing. And once that industry had to change institutions, and his was not the one that went forward, even though the ideas went forward. And those are the things that change. Our institutions will be gone, and I have already experienced that more than once. But we can tell stories that help show the universality of what they do, of how we contribute to it in a very systematic way, and also how our technology and what we do with that technology helps the world and shows our contribution to it. At this part, as part of changing institutions, the one way that I'm exploring that, since I've been a writer for computer for so long, I'm pushing into new fields, is I run an audio drama. Why do you run an audio drama? Because it's like doing drama on the radio. It grabs the imagination, and you can travel to places you would never go to if you had to do it with pictures. Furthermore, it's inexpensive to do, it's readily distributable, and it is ready-made for institutions like the one that I work with. It's a group called Invisible Friend that is globally distributed, has many points of view, and comes together on the internet to tell a story. And that's what we do. And if you'd like to listen to some of them, that'll be my pitch for what I am doing now. But that's an institution making use of the technology that wasn't available or easily available 20 years ago to create a story that is universal and is yet at the same thing of our time. So with that, I will leave you with my contact information. And should there be any questions, I would be glad to take them. And if there are not, I will wish you a good day and thank you for being part of this webinar.
Oh, we're not going to let you out of here without any questions. That's for
I
sure.
don't know, that would work for me.
There's already a question in there. If anybody else has any questions, please put them in there. I know I have a ton. You've brought up a lot of great ideas, and I'll be honest with you, I'd like to delve into some of those and maybe look at some others if you don't mind.
Sure.
So let's start with the question that we have currently in the Q&A. So the person asks, as you have experienced during the pandemic, it seems that face-to-face conferences are moving towards virtual conferences, and you are aware that there's a big difference between these two worlds. Mm-hmm. How can you help me to effectively forward your story, expertise in digital world to the next generation? And then they say, please isolate the problem to your second story of Rosemary's story and give me only one important advice, such as an advice that scientific institutes can be adjusted with your advice. Now, I can push that to the slide area. It's a really long question, so if you'd like to see it, I can push it to the slide area.
It's a really long one, and thank you. If I can just sneak in a little thing about Rosemary. I made a comment about, she stated, it's her story. It still is. She knows that I use it now. We've had a long talk about it, so I have her permission. Social media, of which online conferences are one form of them, have a lot of different attributes. And if I'm to isolate one that we need to think how to be effective on, it's moving from the I to the we. It's very easy to think of this as a self-promotive thing, as something where you're telling your story, where you are, in particular, doing the things that make you distinctive, the qualities that separate you from others. That's all fine, and that's wonderful, and if you're working on TikTok and you're trying to make a name for yourself as a teenager, good for you. But that's not what we're doing. We're building a community. And so conferences, webinars such as these have to be structured for something that incorporates what is us, what is the we, what is the community that is working together. How do you tell a story that embraces a larger group? Now, in the work that I have been doing the last 3 or 4 years with the audio drama, it's been very clear to me that the way to do this dramatically is to get a large group of dispersed people and get them focused on a single topic, in many ways like a webinar, like an online conference. It seems to me that in developing conferences, and in particular, going to a new model of them, because I think the current model, the current institutional structure is failing them. And if we go back to the roots, we will start to see new ways of doing it. We will see that we're not limited by place. We're also not limited by time. And that there are ways in which we will start to build them and think as a conference as perhaps over a longer time, get people or small groups of them together to talk about their ideas, to build a sense of us, of sharing, of communal work, of education, to get ideas out over little bits that when we all gather for one thing, there's more of a background and more of a commonality. In particular, I am reminded that one of the early set of all electronic conferences happened when I was Computer Society president, which would have made it 2013, and that was the Boston, I believe it's the Boston massacre bombing. And I had to call a conference that was being held in Cambridge and said, there's a lockdown, you can't hold it. And they said, oh no, we're all online. And they had figured out how to do it, and they were holding it at their conference hotel, was all doing it back and forth online. More power to them. But what has come out of that, particularly during the pandemic, has been one that has tried to replicate the conference with a single time and a single meeting point. And I think part of the process has to be rethinking how we engage it. And one of the things, the conference that in particular I dealt with said, you know, we had so many papers that in particular student papers had 3 minutes. You can't do much in 3 minutes, particularly at a conference where you get 3 minutes, 3 minutes, 3 minutes after another. But in spreading that apart and breaking it apart, of using other times, of leaving material out there, you have much more flexibility, and you have ways of letting the students and letting the researchers build their own community over an extended time. And I'm far from the greatest thinker on any of these, but I do know that the new institutions for conferences are going to have to be collective. They're going to have to focus on the we, and they're also going to have to recognize that they not only break the barriers of space, They break the barriers of time, and they can exploit that to their own benefit.
All right, that's a great answer. Here is another question that has come in. They say, does a story need to have a struggling character in order to be a successful story? Or could it just be a story about failure?
Story about failures are good. No, a struggling and a victory are not always necessary for it. But most stories are always of the form, here's a problem, this is the solution, and this is what happened when we tried the solution. We do not tell enough of two kinds of stories. One is obviously the story of failure, and that is in part because no one ever got tenure, no one ever got a raise by telling a story that said, we tried this, and boy, did that cost us a lot of money. But we need to know that because we need to understand where the pitfalls are, and also where potentially there are some interesting problems that need solutions. The other one we don't really tell enough of comes from when you go to the regional conferences. And as Computer Society president, and to some extent as distinguished speaker, you get to go to those a lot. And they are a lot more interesting than people give them credit. They think of them as, papers that don't bubble up to an international scale. That may be true. But they are really about communities coming together, trying to figure out how new methods work, how they can incorporate them in their own work. And they often involve a lot of work that, if is not direct repeats of what others have done, they're pretty close. They're taking a technology that someone has developed for some problem and saying, let me try it on something that's close. Let me do it on a problem that's a little bit different. And in seeing these, you start to get a big and a vast wealth of understanding of how the new ideas are coming out, how they interplay, how some of the subtleties work, the difficulties and ease of implementing them, how readily they're going to be capitalizable. And seeing those stories, these repeats, that are, we tried it here, we got this a slight difference, and understanding those kind of repetitions are important. And it's something I wish we did better, and I would hope that with regional conferences now going online too, that we would do that in a way that others could look in and say, this is a better understanding of an idea than we would get by just reading a single paper or going to a single big conference.
Okay, great. The next one actually is just asking whether we can share that invisible friend link again. They say it's not easily found on the web, so they would like to have that up there. So,
okay, we can do that, yes, because the web keeps wanting to do it. Because they don't want to spell it. The joke is that we're following a company that is largely run by children, real children, and they have a security package that they are selling to kids called Invisible Friend because they don't know how to spell invisible yet. And that is our artist's depiction of one of the kids.
So while we're on this one, I'd like to throw in one of my questions, if I could. You've talked about the changes in the stories that we're telling. I was wondering if the technology is changing the type of stories we're telling. So obviously, you had the change from orality to literacy, from printing press and on, and those changed the ways that stories were told. Now, are the stories that we're telling about ourselves as technology professionals, are those changing with the ways that we tell our stories?
Mm-hmm. Oh, very much so. And it's what's happening to stories writ large. And again, it is something that we can help others explain. Our technology, because it delivers so much and because time is such an important thing, demands of us to shorten, trim, tighten up our stories. If you look at the kind of technological stories that were published about the early computer industry in the 50s and 60s, if you read old Datamation articles or even old copies of Computer, and I admit I am the only member of the society that loves to read 1960s and 70s articles in Computer. We had longer articles. We got into longer details. They were more discursive. They went in directions that were less predictable. We demand now that stories be shorter, tighter, that they focus on specific ideas. You see this at an extreme in conference proceedings, because there's no conference in computer science worth its salt that does not send out a template for what your paper should look like. And so you fill in the blanks, and there's your article, and it follows the standard template. That limits us at the same time, and it also demands the creativity of thinking beyond it. And the creativity thinking beyond it, we haven't done enough of it yet. The limitation is that we often miss connections to others, because part of the stories that we are always doing is saying, let me tell you of a solution, and let me then give you a question. And we don't do enough of the give a question part anymore, and we don't allow that to come out serendipitously. The two stories that I gave, the one of Rosemary and the one of Lois Lurgan's, are interesting stories that have serendipitous things that moved forward into my life. And that kind of serendipity, that kind of benefit that you don't see, gets lost a little bit. But there's no reason it can't be there. There's no reason it can't be tied in. There's no reason that we can't start thinking in terms of where might this go and who should try to hook into it.
Okay, fantastic. The next one's less of a question and just more of a statement. They say, your storytelling is a wonderful session and great learning for me. My gratitude to you for sharing your deep insight into narrating the story. And with perfect technical communication with a blend of business knowledge. So clearly they enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. One can only be grateful for an audience, and one can only be doubly or triply or many times over grateful for an audience that sees some good in it. And that's what my column in Computer has been. And I should perhaps note that there are two compendium of my columns from Computer Magazine that have been published. One is called The Company We Keep, and it has that picture of my dad on the cover. Nope, that's too soon to tell. And then that's available through Wiley. And then the IEEE Press did one called The Company We Keep. And that was more focused on students and the rising generation. It has a picture of students on the cover. So those are both available. And if you have access to the electronic library, you'll discover that they're all available out there.
Okay, I think this is probably going to be our last question since we are a little bit over. The person says, can we say that respect for diversity and knowledge of diversity is a relatively good answer for the question that this person had asked earlier? It was the really long question.
The respect for diversity is just a deeply, deeply important thing. And it's sort of the specific strategy for dealing with what is, of course, the universal problem, which is respect and love for others. I mean, at some level, you have to start with that, but then you have to move on and particularly start focusing on those that you might not have always felt the kind of respect that you need to do. It is. There is one member of my team that I have been working with that is also a Detroiter, who is another Greer, who is from the African-American branch of our family. We have figured out that we're sixth cousins and have enjoyed working with each other and have been surprised at the lessons we have learned in terms of working with each other, even though we share a whole bunch of things in common. And that, I think, points to the strategy or points to the idea that there's a lot out there, that there's a lot of good out there, and it takes a very active, direct, and positive effort to see that. We're at a little bit of a period where it stirs up a great deal of anger and negative forces, and negative forces colliding only produce more. In looking out and in telling a story and understanding where you are and what benefits are coming from it, a story of appreciation is always a good thing to help move things forward. And I think if my stories are anything, I would hope people would say they're appreciative. So thank you very much.
I think that's a great place to end. I'd like to take this moment to thank Dr. Greer. I'd also like to thank all of you for attending. Our next in the series of webinars on the history of computing will be Making Up Minds, Computing and Proof in Post-War United States. That'll be by Professor Stephanie Dick on November 10th at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. We have several others in this series, as well as in the Distinguished Lecturer webinar series. And our Build Your Career webinar series will have a presentation on persuasive conversations, why low-impact words don't work. That'll be by Elsa Velasco-Paul on November 18th. Registration is now open, and we'll be sending you a link to these future events along with the recording of this webinar. Again, Dr. Greer, this is great. We've really enjoyed having you on.
Well, thank you. I've been very pleased to have been asked and very grateful to be here.
All right. Goodbye, everybody.